Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this last day of special events in link with the exhibition Fabulous Fabergé. The museum is proud to present in a Canadian exclusive the finest Fabergé collection outside of Russia from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. The exhibition comprises some 240 objects, including 4 of the 43 remaining famous Easter eggs commissioned by the Romanovs. It is a great honor, and I might add a great pleasure, to introduce you our guest, Dr. Géza von Habsburg, one of the leading specialists on the Russian master. He will explain to us the fascination and the enthusiasm still surrounding Fabergé and Fauxbergés. Dr. von Habsburg is the curatorial director of the London-based Fabergé Company and the author of a number of books on the life and works of the jeweler, including the major scholarly publication that accompanies the Richmond collection entitled Fabergé Revealed at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Géza von Habsburg.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very nice of you to come in such large numbers despite the rain. We are going to have a closer look today at certain aspects of Fabergé, which are very close to my own heart, and I will explain why as we go along. What I expect to do is to muddy the waters to such a point that nobody will know what is Fabergé and what isn't. This slide you saw yesterday for those who came, and it represents Fabergé's first appearance in public in 1882 at the Russian Pan-Slavic exhibition under the patronage of Tsar Alexander III. And why I show it is that Fabergé, first of all, they are faithful copies of Greek or Scythian 4th century BC jewels found along the coast of the Black Sea, and brought in large numbers to the Hermitage where all these things were kept. And as by chance, Fabergé had full access to the treasury of the Hermitage and was actually involved with repairing these things. So as the exhibition approached, he asked permission to copy them. And when he showed them, he was hailed as the great innovator of Russian jewelry because certain techniques, in particular granulation, had been lost over the centuries, and Fabergé had relearnt this technique and showed these jewels and was hailed truly as the great innovator of Russian jewelry at that time. In fact, these are not jewelry in the true sense of the word. They are archaeological jewels, so no stones of any sort. The Russian public, of course, did not know that these things had been produced in Italy and in France and in London already beginning in the 1870s. So Fabergé was not truly an innovator, but within Russia, this was something completely new. Now, why I show this to you is that Fabergé opened. What follows is pure speculation, so don't go on spreading this news. It's my own very personal point of view. Fabergé opened, he opened in St. Petersburg, 1872, Moscow a bit later, and then in Odessa, I think in 1886 or something like that. And in 1889, something very curious happened in Odessa, namely a pair of very disreputable antique dealers commissioned a major piece of archaeological jewelry from a local goldsmith called Israel Ruchomovsky. And interestingly, what Ruchomovsky produced, you see here on the right, it's the world-famous crown of Saitafernes, king of the Scythian tribe. And Ruchomovsky produced this with all knowledge of all the techniques of granulation, which nobody else really knew about except Fabergé, who just happened to be also in Odessa. So this is my first speculation that there was some indirect connection. This crown was offered to the Kunsthistorisches Museum for a lot of money. They turned it down, and then to the Louvre. And the Louvre thought that this was a major, major acquisition. And they paid 100,000 gold crowns for it. And it was hailed as the greatest find and acquisition, but very quickly rumors started circulating that this was in fact a forgery, and Mr. Ruchomovsky heard of this in Odessa, and he took the train to Paris, and he said, "Hey guys, it's me, I did this crown," and nobody believed him, of course. But then he started producing objects in this very same technique. Like, for instance, this little flacon that I found in a private collection outside of New York, and he was able to prove that he was indeed the maker of this thing. So, great scandal. But there is a possibility of a connection. Then we know that Fabergé was very interested in Byzantine enamels. And there was in St. Petersburg at that time a collector called Dr. Botkin, and Dr. Botkin was absolutely avid to obtain Byzantine enamels. And he started off with a small collection, and within very few years he suddenly had 120 of them. Where did they come from so suddenly? I mean, they are extreme rarities. They date from the 11th and 12th century, and therefore were quite unavailable. In the center is a perfectly genuine piece of Fabergé with a very faithful copy of a Byzantine enamel of that particular period. That's in the Metropolitan Museum. And we know for a fact from contemporary sources that there was a Mr. Popov who specialized in Byzantine enamels and was making them, and he was connected to the Fabergé Company. Fabergé himself, as he began his career as a craftsman of objets d'art, began copying French works of art in the treasury of the Hermitage. We're talking now of the mid-80s. And there is the legend that Tsar Alexander III challenged him to produce an object which was of equivalent quality and, to a French piece. And Fabergé rose to the occasion and produced one of these two objects. I'm never sure which one. One is French 18th century, 1780, and the other one is Fabergé, and the Tsar was unable to tell the difference. Must say, I can't tell the difference either. But he was so impressed by this that he put them side by side in the treasury to prove what the quality of craftsmanship was at that time. Now, of course, because Fabergé was so well versed in French 18th century enameling techniques and objects, he was accosted by disreputable dealers of the time and said, "Master, please leave your hallmarks off so that we can sell these as 18th century." Of course, no. I mean, we know that Fabergé raised his hands in horror, but who knows? We must train our eyes once more just before we go into the subject of actual forgeries with some of the key pieces of Fabergé craftsmanship. This is maybe the most extraordinary work of art here at the museum. Massive piece of silver. This was one of the very few pieces that escaped melting down in 1918, 1920, and of a superlative quality, of a design that is absolutely unique. So that's the real stuff. The real stuff in jewelry, Fabergé was silversmith, jeweler, and then craftsman for the Tsars of Russia, is a piece of, is one of the finest and very few surviving pieces of jewelry of Fabergé, which I mentioned yesterday, is in the Museum of Natural Sciences in Houston. Incredible craftsmanship, incredible quality of setting of the stones. The French hailed Fabergé when he exhibited in the year 1900 in Paris at the World Fair. They hailed him as being the best craftsman in the technique of stone setting. So that's something that one also has to keep in mind as a specialist in order to discern what is good and what is bad. And finally, the craft of enameling, which Fabergé mastered in a way that no one before or no one since him has been able to emulate. He was hailed again at the same French exhibition in Paris as the greatest craftsman in enameling, and I mentioned yesterday, first of all, he was awarded the Legion of Honor for his extraordinary feats of craftsmanship. And then his colleagues in Paris would say, Louis XV, Louis XVI, where are you? You are now in St. Petersburg, meaning that the quality of craftsmanship of Fabergé was equal, if not superior, to that of French craftsmen of the 18th century. All this we have to keep in mind when we approach the question of forgeries. For me, it all started back in 1986. You can see, okay? Yeah. In 1968, excuse me, when I was a young specialist at Christie's in Geneva, I was approached by the dean of the University of Lausanne, who said, could you please go and investigate the contents of a house which we have just inherited from an old couple of chemists. Swiss dealers have been there, they've found nothing that they were interested in. And crates of imperial porcelain down in the cellar, 16th century icons along the walls, kitchen cupboards full of imperial silver, etc., and a safe full, the safe had no key, so I had to bring a locksmith and burnt a hole in. Hey presto, out came objects of this nature about which I knew nothing. I was straight out of university, knew about cathedrals and Michelangelo and Rembrandt and so on. But I did find upstairs in the attic all the fitted cases. All original Fabergé came with fitted cases into which these things fitted, and which had in Cyrillic the name of Fabergé. But what was particularly intriguing is when I offered these pieces at auction in Geneva, people came from all over the world to buy these things. They had belonged to, it turned out, to a couple of diplomats who had been en poste in Moscow, French diplomats, in 1926. First among all the diplomats, Russia was a closed country immediately following the revolution, 1924. 26, it opened up, and these diplomats were there like pivoleuses, like the magpies, picking up pieces wherever they were available, and they were available in large numbers because people were dying of hunger. There was nothing. There was a terrible famine, and they sold whatever they had for nothing. And Monsieur and Madame Herbette, God rest in, may they rest in peace, used the diplomatic pouch to bring all these things out to Paris in large numbers. They worked together with the French dealers who told them what to look out for, and Fabergé was one of the things that they requested. And these two ended up on Lake Geneva with this safe full of extraordinary things. So this set me on my career, curious as I am. I did write, as Daniel mentioned, a number of books, I think 13 in all, about Fabergé, organized 5 or 6 exhibitions, 2 million visitors. So I became, in a way, identified with Fabergé, which is the reason why I probably know more about forgeries than anyone else, because I've handled thousands of Fabergé objects, the real stuff. And I've handled more than that in forgeries. So when you have the opportunity of really seeing these things side by side, you get what is called a gut feeling, which normally is unerring. I was going to say, normally it's pretty difficult to lead me astray, but it does happen nevertheless. There's nobody who is perfect. Now, during my 20 years at Christie's in Geneva, sort of halfway through my career there, I was asked more and more, left, right, and center, to go and look at things in the hope that they could be sold in Geneva at the specialized sales, which I organized there twice a year. And one day, I got a telephone call from somebody with a very thick Russian accent. "Mr. Habsburg, please come to Rome. I had just arrived from Moscow and have many Fabergés." Of course, I went, and he had a room with his whole family. They were recent émigrés from Russia, and suitcases stacked up to the ceiling filled with, well, I was to discover many interesting things. So he opened his first suitcase, and out came an object which was quite familiar to me, and then a second piece and a third, and I knew all these pieces because they were illustrated in books. Now, the first thing that you have to learn is that what Fabergé makes, 90% of the cases, is one of a kind. So as soon as you see a second one, or a third one, or a fourth one, he actually had a series of 6 identical ones. So what is interesting is, I mean, we know who made the things, because I come to that in a minute. What is interesting is that the only way that these early forgers in Russia could work was from books with illustrations. So the first book on Fabergé was published in 1949, the second one in 1953. So all the forgeries in those suitcases were copies of the pieces in these books. And of course, what is typical in cases like this is that the front view was good. That's what people saw in the photographs. But if you turn them around, you could see that these gentlemen were not really that great. So there was. I told this gentleman, nada, this is nothing. And he said, what should I do with it? And I said, take it to America and see what you can do. And then almost year after year, I would be offered this collection. I don't know if you can see. Carl Fabergé, Art Masterpieces, World's Finest and Largest Private Collection. And if you look at the pieces, those who know their Fabergé, everything is a copy of something that existed already. And there are 2 more pages. Actually, there were 4 of these things. There were 100 pieces. Virtually every year, I was offered this collection, but belonging to somebody new, somebody different. And somehow I felt if there was a year when it wasn't offered, that there was something wrong. So these are the first cases of Russian forging in large quantities. And what these master forgers did, the head of the gang was called Naum Nikolayevsky, God rest his soul, he's no longer with us. He was an excellent stone carver in his own right, but of course, to make money, it was better to make the Fabergé rather than his own things. And he sold mostly to diplomats because the diplomats could smuggle these things out of the country in their diplomatic valise diplomatique. And once they were in London, they would come to see me and they would be horrified about their mistake, but could do nothing about it because they had brought these things out illegitimately. So these things went from hand to hand, and I got to hear more and more about Mr. Nikolayevsky. And one day in Geneva, a very elegant gentleman came to see me with white hair, very distinguished, and he brought me 2 pieces. One was a beautiful Fabergé cigarette case. I said, yeah, I was hoping to get it for the auction. And the other one was this, and this was one of several that had passed in New York auction houses, or one particular auction house. And I happen to know because colleagues of mine told me that this was by Naum Nikolayevsky, and I said to him, sir, I'm afraid that this is by a gentleman called Mr. Nikolayevsky. And he didn't bat an eyelid and did not leave his cigarette case either. But it was him. He was trying to see if he could smuggle things, forge things into a Geneva auction. Train our eyes again. These are 2 little masterpieces of stone carving from Fabergé's workshop. They belong to the Queen of England. I said yesterday she doesn't even know how many she has. There's probably around 250, but you see the quality of the taille de pierre, the stone carving in agate and in obsidian there, and how brilliant this is when you see an original. And then we have another master forger that I learned about called Dimitri Monastirsky. And Mr. Monastirsky, God rest his soul, otherwise I couldn't speak about him openly, lived in St. Petersburg, and he produced things of high quality which the Russian experts could not sort of identify, and so his things ended up in Russian museums. That is a Shire stallion belonging to the Queen of England, and that is a Monastirsky. And the way that you can tell, apart from the quality, the much poorer quality of craftsmanship, is that the hoofs of the horse are set with diamonds. So that would be something that Fabergé would never ever dream of. It was exhibited at the Kremlin for many years. Now they have withdrawn it. Mr. Monastirsky produced the monkey that's up there, which is a straight copy of a genuine Fabergé chimpanzee, which was wonderful, also in honey-colored agate. And this too ended up in a Russian museum. Monastirsky again, this elephant, a take on a silver elephant, which is in fact a, what is it? Oh yeah, you can see the tail can be pulled out, so I think it was a cigar lighter. Another well-made fake. He was an excellent stone carver. And now I'm going to start muddying the waters. So Fabergé, one of his best figurines, they're about this high. There were only about 60 or 70 of them. They were exceedingly expensive. Tsar Nicholas was the main collector. And that one is the houseboy at Fabergé. He's got on his cap Morskaya 24. So that's a little portrait figure by Fabergé, absolutely sweet. Then this here. This is an interesting case of expertise. It was brought to me by a Russian lady in Geneva, and I thought it was incredibly good, so I put it in the auction. And one of my colleagues from London, who is no longer among us either, but so I can mention his name, Kenneth Snowman of Wartskis, he said, Géza, this is a forgery. And he was my mentor, really, so he knew far more than I did. And I was worried, but it didn't sell, so the problem really was not mine anymore. But we came across, not I, but other scholars came across a memoir written in 1919 by somebody who had actually worked with Fabergé and who describes in greatest detail this figure here, saying that this was the piece they were proudest of all because it was such an incredible feat of craftsmanship that the apron, for instance, of this painter boy was splattered with paint, and so that it was the most realistic thing that the Fabergé craftsman had been able to do. So attributions can change. Up there is Monastirsky, and I remember when I showed it in an exhibition of mine at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, one of the great Western experts came and said, Géza, this is so good. This is the best stone sculpture that I've ever seen. And this one here was on the front cover of a catalog of an auction house in New York, which shall not be named, which is also by Mr. Monastirsky. But that is really absolutely incredibly good. So stone figures can be good and can be less good. But in the end, it's all about craftsmanship. Excuse me. Again, train our eyes in what is real first. I showed that yesterday. I showed both yesterday. They are perfect examples of the ultimate craftsmanship in enameling. And then our life is very easy with these they are early-ish forgeries, but you can see that the enameling is poor, the whole design is absolutely impossible. No further comment is needed. But then again, to muddy the waters, we come to a case with which I was personally involved, namely the little sedan chair about this high, beautiful, absolutely exquisite, which I was cataloging for one of my auctions in Geneva. And the same Mr. Snowman came and he said, "Géza, that's a forgery." And he said, "Yeah, you know, it's too heavy." And so I picked up, the other one was in the Forbes magazine collection. So I picked up the phone, called my friends at the Forbes magazine collection, and they weighed it, and the Forbes one is heavier. So Mr. Snowman ended up buying that one, which is in fact a better example. But again, expert opinions can differ. Now, the next chapter is the animosity or competition between Cartier in Paris and Fabergé in St. Petersburg. So when the Great World Exhibition took place in 1900, Cartier did not exhibit at the World Fair, but he obviously saw all the pieces of Fabergé and thought that these were quite exceptional things of great craftsmanship. And he desired to acquire the clientele that Fabergé had in Russia. They were the richest people then virtually in the world. And so he started prospecting the Russian market, sent over his brother, Louis Cartier sent over his brother Pierre in 1904 with the instructions of investigating the market and seeing what he could learn about it. And Pierre Cartier started acquiring works of art from the craftsmen who supplied Fabergé. In particular, one was called Mikhail Ovchinnikov. And Ovchinnikov also supplied Fabergé. So we have the cases now of Cartier buying from Ovchinnikov, taking them to Paris, selling them as Cartier, Fabergé buying from Ovchinnikov and selling them as Fabergé in St. Petersburg. So things become a little complicated. These two drawings come out of the acquisitions ledger of Cartier of 1904, which showed two animals he bought from Ovchinnikov. And that one there is actually in the Pratt collection in a Fabergé box. So we know where it came from, and we know that Fabergé also bought from the same source. And the same thing here, that is Cartier's drawing, and that is in the Pratt collection, is a piece that we consider as being by Fabergé. I show you a number of cases where it's almost impossible to tell what is what. One is Cartier, one is Fabergé. One is Fabergé, one is Cartier. And Cartier bought his, which is that one, from the same Ovchinnikov, and he brought it to Paris in 1904 and sold it to a man whose name is very famous, J.P. Morgan. And J.P. Morgan gave it to his girlfriend, and his girlfriend's daughter or granddaughter has this piece sitting in Paris in her apartment. So we know where that came from exactly, and that is Cartier, and that one had its original fitted case, Fabergé. More complicated. The same Pierre Cartier went to Moscow and investigated the market there and came across a man whose name I have a senior moment I have forgotten, who was a craftsman there, who was supposed to be under exclusive contract with Fabergé and produced marvelous objets there, but also was quite agreeable to sell to Cartier. So there were about 120 pieces that Cartier bought from the same guy in Moscow, and that is Cartier, but from the same supplier, that is Fabergé. And it becomes more complicated still because we know that, you see, we know that this one came from Cartier. We know that he bought that in 1906 from this guy in Moscow, and it was sold by Cartier to the same girlfriend of J.P. Morgan, and it's in the same collection as the elephant. And that one there is in the collection of Her Majesty the Queen and was bought by Queen Alexandra back in 1906 from Fabergé in Fabergé's shop. They're identical. So I dare anyone tell me that they know what is what when these things come up at auction, for instance. What one used to be able to say automatically, any animal, c'est du Fabergé. But we now know that this is no longer the case. Fabergé was surrounded by superb stone carvers. Even in the same street in the Bolshaya Morskaya, there were a number of stone carvers, as we will see in a second. Oh, I forgot to say, to make things even a little more complicated, is that Pierre Cartier actually sent somebody to buy from Fabergé. And this is the page from Cartier's acquisitions ledger again, where all these items are listed. And they were taken to Paris, and you find them in photographs which say modèle. So Cartier gave it to his own craftsmen in Paris to use as a model, and then he sold them to his clientele as being Cartier. And then we have the extraordinary stone carver, Denis Ofuralski, who had a shop right next to Fabergé in the same street. And one of these two is by him. The one on the right you can tell because it has bronze feet. And we also know, or are pretty sure, that Fabergé bought from him and put gold feet on the animals that he took from his colleague. This one is actually in a fitted case by Fabergé, and that one is in a box by Denis Ofuralski. And we come to the extraordinary chapter of Arm and Hammer and Mrs. Pratt, and which is almost the main reason why I was particularly keen to research the collection of Mrs. Pratt and write its catalogue. So his father was a founder of the Communist Party in the United States, sent his son, age 21, to Russia. He became a friend of Lenin's and had a very good and productive time in business in Russia. And when Lenin died, things changed, foreigners were expropriated, and Arm and Hammer had to leave. And in order to compensate him for what he left behind, he got permission to select from the tens of thousands of objects, 100,000 of objects that was being sold by the Bolsheviks at that time. So he made sure that he got a fair deal, but more interestingly so, is that the Bolsheviks appointed him as their sole agent for the sale of Russian treasures in America. and they supplied him with a set of hallmarking tools, which came from the Fabergé workshops, with the instruction of hallmarking any objects which were not hallmarked in order to make them more commercially interesting. So we will see what happens. We usually talk of a quartet of ladies who bought from Arm & Hammer: Marjorie Merriweather Coast, Matilda Stream, and Mrs. Senior Moment, lived in Cleveland. These were three of the ladies, and the fourth one was Mrs. Pratt. And Mrs. Pratt was a dashing lady in her young days, but looked more, God rest her soul, like a housewife, a common housewife in her later days. But she was totally, passionately enamored in everything that was Fabergé, because Arm & Hammer made sure that every single object that he sold had an imperial provenance. So anybody who bought from him, they knew that they had a piece of history, because this was something that the Tsar or the Tsarevich or the Grand Duchess so-and-so had in her hands. And they kind of identified with the Romanovs and their tragic fate. And in order to make this more credible, Arm & Hammer had, for each of the pieces that he sold, a little roll of parchment with a double-headed eagle with the attestation that this came from the private apartment of Tsar Nicholas, from the playroom of the Tsarevich, from the bedchamber of the Tsarina, and so on. Nothing came without that. And this is really what made the three ladies before, and Mrs. Pratt particularly, keen in buying from him. Right. Another nice conundrum here. In order to be able to, Mrs. Pratt was a great collector of frames. They are all beautiful, they are all perfectly genuine, but to make them saleable, Fabergé, Arm & Hammer used a very particular technique, which we shall see herewith. That is a beautiful Fabergé frame with a portrait, I think, of Queen Alexandra, sister of the Russian Dowager Empress, so perfect. This one here is a beautiful Fabergé frame, but with a photograph of a photograph of a photograph, fourth generation of a photograph of the Tsarevich. So it had nothing to do whatsoever with the frame, but the fact that it was in the frame, it became a piece of historical importance. And the same is with all the frames that Fabergé sought, with three exceptions. All the photographs in the frames do not belong together with the frames. But they became part of the legend because Arm & Hammer sold them with a little scroll with saying that this came from so-and-so. So the pieces that you see here, this is a perfectly genuine non-Fabergé frame, which was sold as Fabergé, with a perfectly ungenuine photograph of a painting of Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna. And these two are by other craftsmen, but one called Karl Hahn. And the photographs, again, have nothing to do with the thing, and yet they were sold as Fabergé. We come to the great dada of these ladies, which were flowers. They were particularly keen on flowers. And they were incredibly rare. As I said yesterday, there are only 60 or 80 known, and the Queen of England has 25 of them, this being one of them. You see how delicate they are, how exquisitely they are composed, how they're just little works of magic. Hammer was being supplied by the Russians right up till World War II with things that were perfectly genuine. 1938, nothing came out of Russia. And Hammer had created a large demand for these flowers. So, what's easier? He had them made. This, I just show you, this is, of course, the greatest piece of Fabergé of all, so just look at it, and when we get to what was being sold to Mrs. Pratt, and not only to Mrs. Pratt, there was another lady, one of the members of the quartet, who bought from Hammer in the same years and bought identical pieces. So remember, there is no such thing as two identical Fabergé pieces. This here, and that here, and that here are all pairs, one in one collection, one in the other collection, sold by Hammer in the same year to two different people. Now, it is my supposition, because where could Hammer have had these pieces made? His brother Victor, in an interview, says that they came from Paris. Who was living in Paris at that time? Two of the sons of Fabergé, Eugène and Alexandre. They had a shop called Fabergé Company, and they had craftsmen from Moscow. A supposition. I leave it at that. These are examples of the hallmarks used by Hammer on different flowers in different collections, and the hallmarks are absolutely identical. And how do I know that all these things are forged? By the fact that Fabergé never hallmarked the stems of flowers. And every single one of the flowers in the Pratt collection and in this other unnamed collection are all hallmarked. It makes life easier for us that way, I must. This here is a really totally fascinating case in point. It was published in many early books on Fabergé as one of his great masterpieces. And I had, during my time in Geneva, one of the grandsons of Fabergé, dear sweet, what was his name? Igor. Igor, who was a sweet little jeweler. He said, Géza, you remember when my uncle was making this piece in Paris? And if you look at it, it has to be a forgery, because Fabergé would have never ever dreamt of letting the stems of his flowers sort of hang in midair. That was inconceivable for Fabergé. All his flowers, the flowers stand on the ground of the rock crystal vase, and they lean against the stem. They can't stand in the middle of the water upright. So all these things are a great help, but the Fabergé brothers, I think that they were the ones who produced this in Paris, put the hallmarks of Papa on there so that it was sold as being genuine for a lot of money in London in an auction in 1976. But if you look at the one next door to it, which is something sold by Hammer to one of these ladies, not Mrs. Pratt, you see that that and that come from the same source, which sort of ties the stories that I was saying together, that I suspect that that came from the sons of Fabergé as well. So, much more easy to identify something that is connected with Canada and that this museum is perfectly aware of. There's a collection in the Museum of St. John, New Brunswick, of Fabergé. They called me one day and said, oh, yeah, we have inherited this collection and we'd like you to look at it. They were all forgeries, every single one of them. And how can you tell? This is now something that is important for us. What we saw before was historical forgeries. You won't see them again. These you will see because this kind of object is being offered still today. And what is the way of identifying them is that they all are overly imperialized. So every piece has either a double-headed eagle or a monogram or a royal miniature or royal crowns or ciphers. So they are fairly easily recognizable. They are crude. Although I must say that the museum in New Brunswick lent me, I asked for the entire collection for an exhibition I held in New York, and I put them all into one large showcase, and the people really couldn't tell the difference. So the untrained eye, of course, has difficulty in seeing this. So much so that I was taking a group of tourists to St. Petersburg, and we stopped in one of the Latvian cities, and there in a showcase, I was lecturing on forged Fabergé on board the ship. And there, on the way up into the old town, I see a window full of Fabergé. So I go inside and I say to the lady, what are these? And she said, Fabergé. And I said, oh my gosh, and what do they cost? Can I buy any? And she said, well, she had an identical one to this one here. And she said, I said, how much is that? And she said, $25,000. And I said, how come? Because 6 months ago, the original, I mean, there was a beautiful box, exactly the same, being sold by Sotheby's in London, and it fetched $250,000. How can you explain that? And she said, sir, we are not in New York here. I thought that was great. These come from the same source again, and they were taken by a Canadian collector, whose name we know, and deeded to the museum against a massive tax write-off. So these are things that you will, for those who are familiar with Fabergé, I have become, because of my sang-froid, or the fact that I have no froid aux yeux, that I'm not afraid of telling people what they have. You'll find nobody. In the trade, nobody will pronounce him or herself on things of what I showed you before, because they don't want to get involved with lawsuits. Well, I've helped out a number of people by getting them their money back, but it's not entirely without risk, because there's a lot of money involved in these things. So I know that these things come from a master forger in St. Petersburg, who's still alive, so we will not mention his name. And I have seen dozens and dozens of these eggs, and they have different colors, they have different contents, but they all have an imperial crown. They all have perfect hallmarks. You can't tell the difference. Under a loupe, you cannot tell the difference, because I'm told that the hallmarks are transferred by laser, I don't know how, from a genuine piece to the forged piece, and therefore there is no difference. So that you even find the specks of dust on the forgery, which were on the original. And how can you tell that these are forgeries? One very easy way is you ask the price. So these things on average are about $25,000, and if they were imperial and what they were supposed to be, an imperial egg. We know how many there were, 50 imperial eggs. They are all accounted for, 8 are missing, 1 was found recently, you'll see it at the end. So these don't fit anywhere, and yet they exist by scores, if not hundreds. And I've forgotten what I was going to say. Recently, this is not this slide, I was asked to go to a state down south to look at a collection of a very old lady, 96 years old, who had bought over the last 20 years Fabergé from one particular source in New York that nobody had ever heard of. And she bought everything there for large amounts of money. She had about 100 pieces. And I walk into her drawing room, and there I see what I see. And I don't really know what to say in these cases, because they say, yeah, well, what do you think? And so on, and look at this, and look at that. This lady had spent on about 100 pieces about $4 million. But I was not allowed to tell her, because she was a very old lady, and the family was worried that she might have a heart attack, because these were her great treasures and her great pride. And what I asked to see one of the invoices that accompanied these pieces, and I saw written it said in big script, Fabergé and so on, and underneath in very little script it said, after the passing of Fabergé. So it would have been difficult probably in court to make him take them back. Now, much more recently, I was asked to go to a country in the Middle East, which shall not be mentioned, to visit a very highly regarded gentleman, and he had acquired, with one wave of the magic wand, a collection of 120 pieces by Fabergé. And I was asked to go there with trepidation, because, I don't have to see the pieces. If you mention one piece and describe it to me, I can tell what it is, or rather what it's not. So I was taken down to the house of this gentleman, and there were about 120 pieces also. He had paid $60 million for them. No comment. And I was confronted in the sitting room of this gentleman by the gentleman and the person who sold them to him. And I really didn't know what to do. They did ask me point blank, what do you think? Can you appraise these things for us, for me, he said. And I had to come out and say that they were all forgeries. The man who sold them was absolutely livid. He said, impossible, this is all genuine, and so on. And the man who bought them also, he didn't really believe me. The trouble was that the person who sold the collection to this sheikh was a cousin of his. And so it was a question of loss of faith of one, and the sheikh did not want to pursue the matter. I said, I can get you your money back. And he said, I said, if you really want to know, send photographs to Christie's and Sotheby's, and they'll tell you the same. And they did, but he did nothing. And what does it mean to them? It's a week full of oil, and $60 million are accounted for. And then we come to one last chapter, which is, well, you can imagine that after saying this to the sheikh, I left that country as quickly as possible because that $60 million, it's tricky to be involved with. So it's not without danger, the whole thing. This is Monastirsky, and that's too complicated now. I think this is oublions. This, we know that there were 50 imperial eggs. We know each year what was produced. 8 of them were missing. But for each year, we know from the invoices what exactly was the egg. And as I said, 8 were missing, were stolen in 1918. So forgers started looking for means to fill these gaps. And one gentleman from South Africa came with this piece, and it's marked 1896. Now, we know that both eggs of 1896 still exist, so this can't possibly be the 1896 egg, yet he was absolutely adamant. And when I wrote, he wanted to give it to the Hermitage against a big tax write-off as well. When I wrote to them to say it's a forgery, he sent me a threatening letter. He says, if you dare ever say that this is a forgery, beware. This is easy because, I mean, it's obviously not an imperial piece. This was, by the way, the slides were in the wrong sequence. These were the cases in which the sheikh's pieces were, all the Fabergé original fitted cases. I thought it was a great photograph. And we know that Fabergé planned to give or planned to sell to the Tsar of Russia 2 eggs in 1917. Now, you have to know that the Tsar abdicated in March 1917 and Easter was in April. So we have the drawings of the Fabergé firm for the 1917 eggs. And this one turned up with, which may or may not be genuine, in a Russian collection, with the original Fabergé invoice, which is a little strange already, because all the invoices are in a state archive, and with a letter written by Fabergé on Fabergé paper, written to the head of the provisional government in St. Petersburg, saying, "Comrade, I wish to obtain permission to hand this egg over to Comrade Romanov, that because he's already paid for it, and he was not given permission." So what is strange simply is the coincidence that all these things are together in one collection. What is stranger still is that the second egg of 1917, for which we have the drawing, by the way, for the birchwood egg as well. This other 1917 egg was unfinished, and there is a fragment of this egg in another Russian museum, the Fersman Museum in Moscow, and the owner of the previous egg said to me, "Mr. Habsburg, that is not genuine. I have the real one." And I said, "Yes, can I see it?" And he said, "Not yet." And then he called me and said, "Now." No comment. I shouldn't really say anything about this, but it's just a case. I'll leave the decision as to whether it's genuine or not open. The 1902 missing egg is described simply as green stone, left, right, diamond miniature. And this turns up coming from a Russian source in New York, and I'm asked to go and see it, and I look at it, and I ask several colleagues to look at it. I have somebody come from Germany to look at it. We sit around it, and we take it apart completely, and we couldn't make up our minds. I thought it was a forgery, and two of my colleagues thought it was genuine. What I think is the case is that this egg is genuine, but did not belong to this, which is typical forgery. We know the style of the forger. But it was offered the first time for $6 million, then for $12 million, then for $18 million, and I was asked to sell it on behalf of the owner for $20 million, and I'm told that it was now just sold in Russia for $22 million. There's a book published about it by colleagues of mine in Russia. But we end on a happy note, that not all is forged, although 99% of what I am shown in email messages, which are almost daily, from auction houses and people who have acquired these things or whose things come from their family and these things were owned by their grandmother and they are made a week ago. Or so provenances mean absolutely nothing, but these are 3 cases of perfectly genuine things which sadly I was not involved with. This figurine, which I showed yesterday, of Kamer Kazak Pustinikov, the guard of the personal guard of the Dowager Empress, who slept in front of her door and always was on her coach behind. There are numerous photographs of him. Turned up in a little village on the Hudson in an attic. With its original Arm & Hammer invoice. Fetched $6.5 million. The middle one was unknown. It's like the Easter eggs of Fabergé, but was not for Easter. It was for the great Jewish family Rothschild. And they bought it from Fabergé in 1902, and it turned up out of the blue and was sold for $19 million not so long ago in London. And the last one is, you will have read about it, many of you I'm sure, this turned up on a flea market in the Midwest and was indeed, it was bought as scrap by the gentleman who owned it first, and he tried to sell it as scrap to various colleagues, and they wouldn't take it because he was asking too much. And then, this is where the extraordinary side of technology comes in. It has a watch by Vacheron Constantin in it, which is very unusual. And it happened to have been sold back in the mid-60s in New York, without it being called Fabergé, at Park Burnett, and disappeared since. And the way to, I mean, first of all, there's the original invoice, which describes a golden egg with a watch. And then there is a photograph of an exhibition in 1902 in St. Petersburg, the only exhibition of Fabergé there, where you can see it sitting in the bottom shelf of one of the showcases, which gives it a perfectly genuine attribution. I think he paid a couple of $1,000s for it. When he went online, a friend of mine had published a little something saying that there is a missing egg with a watch by Vacheron Constantin, and hey presto, he said, hey! And he took it to London, and indeed, it turned out to be perfectly genuine. I went to see it, and it was sold for $20 million. So there are 8 missing eggs, now 7. And why this is interesting, and this should interest all of us here, is that in this showcase, behind, mirrored in the glass, reflected in the glass, there is another one of the missing eggs. And I know that it's here in North America because Arm & Hammer sold it without knowing what it was. He lists it as a little puto, angelot, a little angel, pushing a wheelbarrow, and on it is a clock. And that's exactly how it's described, so in the Arm & Hammer invoice, also on the invoice of the Soviets when they sold it. And it's reflected in the glass of this vitrine. It's somewhere here in North America. I've been here for 24 years, and wherever I go to all the dealers that I can, I go to all the yard sales, to look, just in case. Now, I may not be here very much longer, but you, ladies and gentlemen, keep a lookout. There's $20 million worth somewhere here in North America. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.